Okay, so we're going to start talking about a time period in America that directly followed that of Reconstruction. It's been given the name by historians the Gilded Age, and I want to take a minute and talk about what that actually means. So if you notice the spelling of the word, gilded means to be thinly covered in gold. Okay, so just a thin covering of gold, which alludes to the fact that while something may look great on the outside, right, it might look glamorous, it might look like it's worth a lot, it might be prosperous looking from the outside, that may not be the same on the inside. So the quality may not be the same through and through. And in this case, when talking about this time period in America, we're really talking about the fact that on the outside, America looks as if it's stepping onto the world stage. It has made huge leaps and bounds as far as its influence in the world, its wealth as a country. But if you scratch away the surface, if you scratch away that gold coating, there are a lot of deep-seated societal issues in America that included things like corrupt business and governmental practices, prejudice against immigrants, just to name a few. So this time period also centers around the industrialization of America. So we've talked in class about kind of the factors for industrialization, and you guys learned about that last year. But in particular, in America, there are kind of two key things that I believe were essential to US industrialization. And that is mostly that the government and entrepreneurs were willing to invest in new businesses. And then, of course, America had the land and resources to make large production and manufacturing possible. So one of the key factors that kind of stems from both of those things is the development of railroads. So this is key to US industrialization because it was key to the connection of the country. So in 1850 to 1865, the last year of the Civil War, there was roughly 35,000 miles of track in the United States, and most of that railway track was in New England and the Midwest. Very few railways extended west of the Mississippi, and there was no national network, meaning that they weren't connected in any real way. These were privately owned companies that maybe, dealt with a track that was in a particular state or maybe connected one state to another. But there was nothing that was organized to connect the nation east and west. It should also be said that the materials used to build these early railroads were not ideal. Iron is incredibly soft, it's not durable, it doesn't last in bad conditions, which of course we know, we live in New England, bad conditions are a part of life. And in addition to that, railway travel was not used often because it was uncomfortable, it was slow, and it was oftentimes dangerous. So there wasn't a lot of movement of goods and services and people in the United States until after 1865 because of the shortcomings of the railway system. Now, when we get to industrialization, so in the years between 1865 and 1900, we see a huge increase in the miles of track that were laid in the United States. So in 1865, we had 35,000. By 1900, we have 193,000 miles of track. This track has been better organized and better connected by a few key rail companies and the government. So the transcontinental network is officially completed in 1869 with the kind of eastern line meeting the western line in Promontory Point, Utah. And just like that, we have a nation that is connected coast to coast by a transcontinental railway network. They did this by consolidating rail lines. So the little smaller lines that I just talked about were connected to larger ones that were funded by the government and privately owned companies. And in addition to that, during this 35-year period, they made some important changes to the way that railways were constructed and run. So that by 1900, they were 2 times faster than a stagecoach and 4 times faster than steamboats. So they quickly became the kind of way to travel if you were somebody who was moving throughout the country, but they absolutely became the way to transport goods, and that's huge. So to give you kind of an idea of how we did this, before the Transcontinental Railway, A trip from the East Coast to the West Coast took about 2 months and cost somebody about $300. By 1900, the trip took 6 days for a cost of $150. So this is truly a revolutionized industry that has great and many positive consequences for the nation. Okay. So how did this happen, right? How did we make so much progress in such a short amount of time? And one of the answers to that is that we see government intervention in railway construction. So the government did a key thing here. What the government did was give railroad companies land. Lots of land in the western part of the country had not yet been settled and was therefore federal land. So the federal government gave private railroad companies lots of public land on which they could lay their track in exchange for laying track in government areas, so areas that the government wanted the track to go. Once that track was laid, the government actually benefits. The government didn't give away all of its land. It kept some of the parcels of land where the future railroad would go. What this meant is that once the railroad was built, the government owned land that it could sell off, and now that there was a railroad in the vicinity, that land would go up in value. So by giving out these land grants to private companies, the government is actually making a long-term investment for itself. It's assuring that property values will rise in certain areas, and the government's going to be the one to benefit from that as it sells off its plots of land. To give you an idea of how much land the government gave these railroad companies, about 131 million acres, 7% of the land in the US. At the time, it was worth about $500 million. 75% of these 131 million acres went to 4 or 5 major companies. So very few private companies are benefiting from these land grants, but if you are one of the few, you were making bucks here. So 4 or 5 of the major transcontinental railway companies were really benefiting from these land grants. So the question is, why might the government help? Okay, I'm going to skip this last little thing there. Why would the government help to do this? Well, railroad construction is expensive, and it would have been limited without this help. The government is clearly interested here in internal improvements and settlement of the West. And so anything they could do to speed up that settlement was valued. And here's a picture of Promontory Point, Utah, the place in which the railway companies came together. A great map that shows us the growth of railways. So the green lines refer to lines that were before 1870, and the red lines were railway lines that were constructed after 1870. So I think this map does a good job of showing you that growth. Just another way to look at the growth of railways in the United States, kind of looking at when they were built and how many miles of track. Fun little tidbit, as the Transcontinental Railway completed, what cities quickly realized is that they had to organize their time schedules. A train needed to come through on a schedule, and up until that point, each city kept their own time, each state kept their own time, and so there was a real need to establish time zones. And the revolution of kind of the railway helped that. So there's one of the factors that we just talked about here. I think the second factor that spurs industrial growth, and here's a picture of how that land grant system worked really quickly before we move forward. You can see that the areas in black were areas that the government gave to the railroad companies, and therefore they could build their track through those areas. And then the white areas would be areas that the government didn't give up, but retained to be sold later for a profit. Kind of interesting the way that works. All right, as I was saying, the second major factor that allows for the US to industrialize is the conversion of the way the US does business. So we see during the Gilded Age the first corporations develop. So quickly, let's revisit kind of the way that business was done in the good old days. So in the good old days, the old system of business, you would have one person or maybe a couple of people who got together and decided, hey, we're going to start a business. They save up their money or capital, same thing, and they put everything that they have into this business so that they can control it and they can run it privately. We call this kind of business a sole proprietorship. Sole proprietorships are essentially small town businesses, right? Support your local business. They can't be too large because those one or few owners only have so much money or capital. And when starting your own sole proprietorship, you are taking on all of the liability that comes with that company. So in other words, if that company tanks, you're on the hook for it. That's the old way of doing business. But industrialization brings about a new system. We start to see public businesses take the place of those smaller private businesses. Public business or corporations are also known during this time as big businesses. Okay? And here's how big businesses worked. You would sell stock in order to raise capital, which limited an individual's liability. So instead of one or two people owning a company, that company is made public, meaning pieces of that company or stock in that company are sold off to willing investors who buy in and become part owner of that company. Thousands of people can buy in to a company and own stock or own a piece of that company. And everyone, therefore, is part owner. Everyone bears the burden of liability if the company goes under, but everyone profits if the company does well. This allows corporations to have more money or more capital to access a larger consumer base. So, whereas a sole proprietorship would basically have a small area in which they could sell their goods to, probably because they didn't have enough money or enough product to sell to a larger demographic, corporations could sell their product nationwide, from coast to coast, or maybe even internationally. They've got the money to invest to do so. These corporations gradually replace smaller and private businesses. And we're going to talk more about corporations in class tomorrow. So jot down any questions that you have on these corporations now. So of course, corporations, and as you can see, these are three key industries in which corporations kind of overtake sole proprietorships: iron, steel, and coal production. We're also going to talk about oil, and you can see here how the United States fares in the production of these goods versus some of its major competitors as a result of industrialization. So, obviously, with more money, corporations were more efficient. They could build more manufacturing plants. They could market their sales to a larger audience. They could invest in infrastructure or partner with companies like railway companies to sell their goods to a wider region. These were more efficient than sole proprietorships. And without the appropriate regulation, corporations can quickly become out of control. In the 19th century, some corporations proceeded to crush their competition. They crushed the sole proprietorships in the same industry as them, and they formed what we call a monopoly on their industry. During the Gilded Age, monopolies were much more common than they are now because of anti-monopoly laws that exist now, and we'll talk more about that later. But basically, you have a monopoly when a corporation has complete control over a service, industry, or product. Okay? During the Gilded Age, the rapid industrialization of certain industries and the conversion of businesses from sole proprietorships to corporations allowed for monopolies to form in industries like oil, steel, electricity, and railways, to name a few. Today, as I mentioned, in our society, there are many anti-monopoly laws, but if we think about companies like Microsoft for computer software, or Amazon for online shopping needs, or Apple for cell phones, right? These are companies that are almost monopolies. They're companies that pretty much dominate their field with only one or maybe a couple of key competitors. So monopolies, on the one hand, prove that a corporation is more efficient, right? Is turning out enough product to take care of the demand. But a monopoly can also be a bad thing, and we're going to talk about that in class tomorrow as well. All right, so if you have any questions on this, definitely jot them down now. Tomorrow in class, we're going to look a little bit more closely at corporations particularly, and what happens when a corporation becomes a monopoly. And we're also going to talk about what are the results of this industrialization, of this conversion to corporations, and of the expansion of railways. All right, guys, thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow.